Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program, as you know, is supported by the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. It tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. So there's a big name in nuclear strategy, Bernard Brodie. And since he was American, perhaps Bernard Brodie, as the Americans pronounce it, he was a young associate professor at Yale. And on the morning of August 7, 1945, and I don't know what he was having for breakfast, but I do know that he told his wife, after reading the New York Times headline about the bombing of Hiroshima, all my work is obsolete. Within 6 months of that event, Brodie and his colleagues, what came to be called the Yale Group, had written The Absolute Weapon, Atomic Power and World Order. That work, in many ways, became the basis for the burgeoning corpus of literature on nuclear strategy. Brodie, of course, made a name for himself by summarizing the changed world, and this is how he put it. Thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. It can have almost no other useful purpose. Now, the almost is the sting in the tail. In the last sentence, almost no other useful purpose. And it went on to become the first building block of the literature on nuclear strategy, with MAD, mutually assured destruction, on one side, and these were the strategists, and NUTS, I love these terms, nuclear use theorists, on the other. The former looked at how best to avoid a war under the nuclear overhang. The latter strategized about how best to fight such a war and win it. It was not a debate between alternative strategies, but over where the emphasis in strategy and planning should be. So this thinking worked at two levels. Keeping war limited, or more appropriately, controlled, even if nuclear weapons were used to take out specific targets. Yes, that's how this entire thing evolved. There was a time people thought that, perhaps you can actually use nuclear weapons and you can use them in ways that will not bring out a massive response, and perhaps you can fight a nuclear war and actually win it. And there were others who thought that fighting conventional and subconventional wars on the periphery is possible while nuclear weapons keep the balance of terror at the center. This is what came to be known as the instability-stability paradox. The first level of analysis, despite the empirical evidence provided by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, argued that wars could be and likely will be fought directly between nuclear weapon states. In the Cold War context, that meant the United States of America and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wasn't particularly interested in the British or the French nuclear so-called deterrent. The question which emerged then was, how could escalation to nuclear warfare be avoided? And that's when two schools of thought emerged. One was led by Herman Kahn, the other by Thomas Schelling. Kahn's concept was centered on escalation dominance, which was a 44-rung ladder of nuclear and non-nuclear escalation. And Kahn's argument was that political authority could control escalation right up to what he called the spasm war. Although, and this must be acknowledged, or shall I say flagged, that he never claimed that his ladder was predictive. Schelling argued for avoidance by making the enemy fear that the process would get out of control. He drew on the uncertainties inherent in the escalation process to achieve deterrence. So while Kahn's strategy of escalation dominance argued for the process being controlled by the state dominating escalation, Schelling advocated letting a situation intentionally degrade so an adversary would conclude that it would be better to turn away from the brink. From where I stand, frankly, mercifully, for me personally and for the rest of the world, neither theory got tested. We actually just got lucky. But the labyrinth we have created for ourselves has only become more confusing with more strange turns and dead ends. The nuclear weapons remain, while we have a number of emerging and emerged technologies, drones, hypersonic weapons, autonomous weapon systems, cyber, space, quantum engineering, artificial intelligence, robotics, biotech, you just name it. This is not even an exhaustive list. To use Schelling's term, shared risk has increased all round, with many mountaineers hanging with the same rope. And I have just one such on the program, Ankit Panda. Panda is the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His research interests include nuclear strategy, escalation, missiles and missile defense, space security, and US alliances. He's the author most recently of The New Nuclear Age, At the Precipice of Armageddon. Thank you for being on the program. I was reading your piece in the Caravan. Most of the analyses that have come out seem to have spoken about what India's policy or strategy, if you will, is, in a way which seems to imply as if Pakistan is a passive actor. And so that line by you in that article basically debunks the whole idea that, Pakistan is a passive actor. So if there's going to be, if India wants to slug it out with Pakistan, then there's another state that's also going to countervail that application of force. So give me your first impressions of what do you think, because your article also ends the same Caravan article on a not particularly optimistic note.
Yeah, thank you, Ejaz. First of all, for having me on the show. It's really good to be here to have a chance to talk about this article and broader dynamics in the global nuclear order. And I actually think your introduction with references to Brody, Kahn, and Schelling gives us a nice intellectual baseline on which to have this conversation, because as you'll know, in that article, I, of course, rely quite a bit on Tom Schelling's analogy of the brink being a curved slope to talk about the nature of nuclear risk. So it's sort of fascinating to me that you zero in on that line, because I really feel like what I'm saying there is not anything particularly revolutionary, which is that the process of escalation, conventional escalation, or nuclear escalation, is a strategic interaction between multiple players, right? And both players, if it is a two-way competition, ultimately do get to make choices about how they will up the ante, so to speak. And I think we saw exactly that after, I counted about 5 distinct rounds of exchanges before that kind of final period. And I guess what some of us are now calling the 88, 89 hour war, where things got really muddled at the end when you had a lot of things happening at the same time between India and Pakistan. But after the initial strikes by India, Pakistan, of course, does get to decide how it would respond in turn. We saw the same thing in Balakot. We've seen the same thing in the past in distinct crises. And so that tempo of escalation, effectively rounds of escalation between the two sides, is precisely what took this crisis from something where India, I think, believed it could take the initial strikes. They released a statement saying that they were trying to be non-escalatory, which for me is, of course, not something that can simply be asserted. You do need to actually, escalation is the transgression of thresholds in war as viewed by your adversary. And I think that latter part is really important, because the adversary's perception does matter. And in this case, of course, Pakistan did feel a need to respond, which then in turn drew an Indian response. And that kind of a less optimistic note that I end the piece on essentially is very similar to where my mind was after Balakot, right? Which was that, both sides walked away, the resolution of Balakot being very different from what happened in May 2025. But in a way, now we've had kind of 2 crises where India has crossed, I think, important conventional thresholds that were previously in place. And what I worry about is that this is now setting a new benchmark for what crises between India and Pakistan are going to look like. And that is, of course, dangerous, because it does not, I think, fully acknowledge the potential for these crises to spiral to a point where we could end up at a place where nuclear weapons become implicated. We can talk about the reasons why India has done that, but this is just my analysis of the strategic and tactical dynamics as we saw them play out in those 4 fateful days in May 2025.
That explains it very nicely. And I would certainly don't know what your assessment is in terms of why India did this. But here's the question, kind of an observation / question, which is that there is, for instance, if we go back to Schelling, who talks about the art of commitment in terms of signaling to the adversary not that you may do something, but that you will do something. And that will part of it is a kind of double-edged sword, because there are times where you may not want to just kill the entire thing. You may want to just may the entire thing. But leaving that aside, there seems to be, and that's my impression from the western side of the border. And I would like to get your take on what you think of this. That this is less about a higher politico-strategic objective, what Clausewitz would call the SWEC part of it, and more to do with a domestic political commitment, which has actually become a trap in the sense that every time since you've declared commitment, that every time you do something, there is a response from Pakistan. And that response takes its own toll. And that toll then forces you into escalating. Is this something that you would agree with? I mean, this is my sort of general analysis of how I look at India.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I would agree that since entering power in 2014, the BJP government in India has, I think, tried to move away from the erstwhile standard of strategic restraint that sort of categorized the Manmohan Singh government's reaction primarily to the Mumbai attacks. And of course, we had those series of cross-border attacks, beginning with, I think, Gurdaspur in mid-2015, Pathankot, of course, Uri, which led to the surgical strikes, which were well received by the Indian public. And then, of course, the Pulwama Balakot strikes just in the lead up to India's general elections that year. So there is a domestic component to this. But I also do think that there is something of a strategic theory of the case, because I've been looking at the India-Pakistan dyad for a long time. And one of the great frustrations on the Indian side has been in a way that I think India has felt checkmated by Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence approach, particularly after the move to what some consider to be, lower yield battlefield nuclear weapons in Pakistan, which have really lowered the scope for escalation. Right? I mean, I would love to have your view, but my assessment of Pakistan's nuclear strategy broadly has been to communicate to India that there is no scope for conventional war in South Asia anymore. That door has been shut after the arrival of both countries' nuclear deterrence. India has a very different approach to nuclear strategy. And so if you have been an Indian strategist kind of vexed and frustrated and often felt checkmated by that, by that state of affairs, then what happened in May 2025 is a distinct kind of reset of India's reputation, in a way, reputation for risk-taking. And then, we can talk about what is the strategic logic of the kind of strikes that India carried out. I wouldn't endorse the logic myself, but my analysis of the logic, as I think India would see it, is that, we all know that this goes back to the problem of cross-border subconventional violence, terrorist attacks, Pahalgam being the proximal cause of the May 2025 crisis. And so India's response has been to communicate to the Pakistani armed forces that there will be physical costs to the Pakistani military of what India sees as support for those kinds of cross-border operations, which, again, in the case of Pahalgam, there is this open question about to what extent was that attack directly guided and instrumented by Pakistan, but that is the Indian view. And so in a way, what you get to is something similar to the Israeli logic in Israel's neighborhood, where Israel will try to apply kinetic costs, try to sort of trite organizations. But of course, you're dealing with the Pakistani military, which is a much more robust, larger institution. But in a way, if you look at this crisis, I mean, both sides, I think, suffered significant losses. I think you could make the argument that India wasn't maybe expecting to lose some of its higher end fighter aircraft as it did in the first day of the conflict in particular. But the costs of this crisis, especially as both India and Pakistan are spending down parts of their magazine, they are suffering strikes on their national territory. The Indian theory of the case is that this will induce some level of caution because there will be costs imposed in exchange. So it's trying to apply something of a deterrence by punishment logic for this very difficult problem that we've kind of wrangled with in South Asia now for about 28 years, which is in the post-nuclear era, India and Pakistan trying to pursue their strategic objectives under the nuclear shadow. And so in the Caravan article, basically what I observe is that the reason I sort of dubbed this the first crisis of the third nuclear age in South Asia is partly due to that shift in how India is now thinking about taking risks, but also, as you, I think, outlined in your introduction, I do think the willingness to take risks in this particular case by India is a result of the very different set of non-nuclear technologies that are now at play in the region. Because during Kargil, for instance, which is the most prominent example of warfighting between two nuclear-armed countries before May 2025, we don't see this kind of risk-taking, because I do think there genuinely was a fear during Kargil of inadvertent escalation, sort of slipping down that curved slope that I talk about in the piece, that Schelling talks about. And now I think there is a sense that not only in India, but also perhaps in Pakistan, that this curved slope can be traversed somewhat. And of course, that's risky. And, we both, India and Pakistan live to tell the tale this time. But the conclusion that I sort of come to is that that might not be guaranteed in the future.
Yeah, you put a lot on the table. I just hope that I remember most of the points. Starting with this full spectrum deterrence thing, probably the only one who was, and I can send you my writings on this. I was completely. I said this makes no sense, and I had my own reasons. One of them being that if deterrence actually fails, you cannot essentially basically reconstitute nuclear weapons. So the point here was that these are not war-fighting weapons; they're basically deterrent weapons at that level of shallow incursion. They were essentially with reference to what is known as the CSP, the Cold Start Doctrine, which was renamed as proactive operations and the rest of it. But when something happens for technology and all of that, and you then reminded of Walter Lapp's great book, seminal book about the tyranny of technology itself. But having said that, your reference to the Israeli playbook is very interesting, because the last longish article that I wrote on this actually has a section on the Israeli approach to deterrence, whether you call it cumulative deterrence, the triadic deterrence, or integrated deterrence. But it is essentially from the Israeli playbook. But here's the thing. And I refer to this because many years ago, I was in Delhi. I was part of the Pugwash, circuit, and that was the first time I met Bob McNamara, and he and I sort of hit it off. And I then watched that documentary that Errol Morris did with him, 11 lessons from the life of Robert Strange McNamara. And the first lesson is about empathizing with the adversary. And he starts with the Cuban Missile Crisis. What I'm trying to make is that two points, actually. One is that strategic restraint by India actually worked to the advantage of India. And I'll specifically refer to the Mumbai episode. And as you know, then Foreign Secretary and later National Security Advisor wrote in his book, that he was in favor of military strikes, but the late Dr. Manmohan Singh thought that it would be better for India to make use of its diplomatic heft and get that kind of support. And we saw that actually worked to India's advantage and Pakistan's disadvantage. But the use of kinetic operations, especially against a peer competitor, which might also have certain niche capabilities that are better than India's, is not particularly, to me, it doesn't seem to be a strategy that is likely to work in terms of deterrence by punishment. Or, of course, I also do not believe that managing escalation or dominating escalation, unless you have an overwhelming advantage, is possible. I also think that, which I find funny, that I don't know if you've seen this ebook that has been put out by CSDR, the Council for Strategic and Defense Research. It has a number of articles which talk about India's ability to manage and dominate escalation, but then also bring in the factor, the elephant in the room, which is the nuclear weapons, and the fact that escalation cannot allow to get out of hand. And as you said yourself, and very rightly, all of it also depends on the adversary, in this case Pakistan, how Pakistan is going to perceive this. And in terms of reputational, this thing, Pakistan has to respond, because if it doesn't respond, then it just loses face. And by the way, just to give you an example, you might recall that Iran did a missile attack in Balochistan, and Pakistan had to attack targets in Iran. And Pakistan was not just signaling to Iran, it was also signaling to India.
Right. Yeah.
So, given my sort of longish observations, I want to get your take. Do you think it would be better for, or even whether it's even possible, given the kind of domestic political compulsion, the rhetoric that now has become the new normal in India, for the BJP government to actually think of opening some kind of communication channels, even if back channels, to try and figure out if something can be done, or just simply go on taking unilateral action or decisions with reference to how it treats Kashmir, how it treats Kashmiris, because that is the red rag to the bull.
Yeah, so I think look, going back to your points about strategic restraint, I think what's interesting is if you take a whole of government approach from the Indian side and you look at the resolution of this crisis, I think India's been rather, of course, upset at the manner in which the United States has handled this, right? Because this has kind of brought to the fore longstanding Indian concerns about, third-party mediation, Donald Trump announcing that India and Pakistan would meet at some third place for a full-scale comprehensive dialogue. Delhi has, of course, strongly rejected that. There's, of course, been the concern about rehyphenating the Indian-Pakistan question here in Washington and around the world in sort of European capitals. That I think sets back in a way what were sort of broader Indian strategic objectives, including under this BJP government. And so I think you sort of are in this place now where, from the Indian perspective, I think there is a push to try and put this crisis behind them. And so the incentives to, in this environment, try and start some kind of back channel or dialogue with Pakistan, I think, are kind of vanishingly small, unfortunately. The other thing is, secrecy in general, I think does continue to have a valuable role, as I sort of hint at in the article, and I think as we know from previous crises between India and Pakistan, and this is a very kind of unsatisfying answer, whenever I tell journalists that we're probably not going to learn the true extent of what happened in May 2025 for about 10 to 15 years. I think I'm being accurate, but also, that is in a way a good thing, because I do think that there was more happening here behind the scenes than we are currently aware of on both sides. I think both with regard to kind of strategic tactical affairs, but also diplomatically. But that's been, I think, a really important part of allowing these crises to kind of de-escalate. India has, of course, been also adamant that the United States actually didn't play a role, right? And I just don't think that that is credible because as somebody that was watching this crisis live, the main concern was that the escalation could continue because we had sort of an American government here in Washington that's very different on these questions. We didn't really even know if they were staffed or ready to even intervene in the way that the U.S. had traditionally done in crises going all the way back to the 1990s. So that is my broader assessment, which is that I don't think, unfortunately, we have this this broader disposition. And of course, then, your reference to Kashmir is interesting because the root causes of this crisis, are very much, I think, left unaddressed. Which is to say that, and I said this in my book where the case study I used was Balakot, and literally the section on India and Pakistan I ended with, there will be another crisis because that is just the structural condition that has been left here. And you don't have to have a strong view on whether these kinds of attacks against Indian civilians, paramilitary forces, or armed forces. These are the three categories of types of attacks we've seen. Pahalgam, of course, being against civilians, which I think did also play a role in India's decision making. But until the broader situation in Kashmir is addressed, these types of incidents will continue, and there will be
You made a point in the article also. You see, the thing is that when I said emphasizing, we've put out 2 or 3 dossiers which have been shared with the Americans also, with other Western capitals also, with the also, with reference to the terrorist attacks in Balochistan and India's support of that. For instance, 2 dossiers recently come out with reference to assassinations in Pakistan, Indian handlers sitting in the UAE and elsewhere. So my point being that this is the kind of subconventional, or call it the metaphoric periphery, frankly, to think it in terms of the Cold War, in terms of the center holding, but the periphery getting destabilized. So there is no physical periphery between India and Pakistan, but metaphorically speaking, if you have the subconventional thing going on, you can call it the periphery. But the center needs to hold, because if the center doesn't hold, then obviously, as you mentioned in your article, then all bets are off. You can't really, because it then moves away from risk management or manipulation or calculation into a realm of uncertainty. And uncertainty obviously is something that you cannot really calculate how it's going to unfold. Unfortunately, your book here is not available. I have been trying to look for it, but I really want to read it. Whenever I get my hands on it, I'll probably then get you to actually talk about the book. But moving on, before we close the program, broadly speaking, in terms of the new nuclear age, in terms of the changing geopolitical circumstances, with Europe now running helter-skelter, trying to figure out what it's going to do itself, trying to even figure out whether it is a collective noun, not very sure how the United States is going to work, not very sure how Russia is going to operate, further as the Ukraine crisis, keeps going on. Then there's, of course, the Middle East, where the Gaza with this genocidal war. So in terms of, since unfortunately I haven't read your book, give me a sort of synopsis of what you say, what you argue in the book. And although it's a pretty recent one, the fact is that lots of other things are kind of changing, unfolding at a high pace. How would you look at it? I mean, where is this thing going?
Yeah, so no, thanks, Ejaz. I appreciate that. Look, I mean, so the book's thesis is one that's perhaps a little surprising if you've been mostly immersed in a Western context for the last 3 decades, right? I actually don't think what the book argues is really news to folks in India and Pakistan, which is that nuclear weapons are back at the center of international statecraft, which I think has been a reality between India and Pakistan, of course, since 1998. And so many of the observations that I make in the book are essentially that, nuclear weapons, of course, didn't go away after the Cold War ended, but the shadow they cast really receded, especially over the United States, Europe, and East Asia. And those dynamics have started to sharply regress for many of the reasons that you described, the shifting role of the U.S. being a big one, China's push for a quantitatively larger nuclear force, but the broader, geopolitical contestation between the superpowers, which is increasing the probability of conventional war between NATO and Russia, between China and the United States, which of course implicates nuclear weapons inherently. And then, as you sort of highlighted at the start of our conversation, many of the technological shifts, particularly with non-nuclear military and dual-use technologies that bear on the nuclear balance in terms of affecting the survivability of nuclear forces. But this is sort of news if you've been kind of of a if you're of a certain age in the West. Let's say you're roughly at the age of your mid 40s or younger. So you kind of came of age maybe at the end of the Cold War or in that immediate post-Cold War world. You haven't really thought too much about nuclear weapons, right? For especially for most Americans my age, the formative national security or defense experience was the 9/11 terror attacks. And so nuclear weapons are now back. And so my book is hopefully an attempt to try and orient a reader with the broader reasons that has happened, the ways in which nuclear weapons are becoming relevant again, and what's meaningfully new and what's not so new, right? We do have the return of old problems from the Cold War. I think Golden Dome is a very good example, for instance, here in the United States, our new system of systems approach to homeland missile defense, a very Cold War set of problems there in many ways. But then you do have the meaningfully unprecedented, the two-peer nuclear environment for the United States, I think, is an interesting one because the Cold War was famously a bipolar contest between the United States and the Soviet Union, two protagonists with roughly able to discover something resembling parity that allowed for arms control. With three players, it's a lot more difficult to find a stable equilibrium. But I actually observe in the book that my own interest in this field actually comes from the fact that I spent 2 years living in Delhi in the late 1990s, and I think the first time I really remember thinking about nuclear escalation, long before I ever really understood what escalation was, or I mean, certainly long before I'd ever read Schelling or Khan or any of those guys, was Cargill, and I think that's really the distinction. And so, actually, the note I want to maybe close out on is, it's interesting that we often see, Americans in particular, I think those of us who study India and Pakistan, trying to share lessons from the Cold War with India and Pakistan, out of an interest in maybe helping India and Pakistan not make some of the same mistakes. But in a way now, 28 years into South Asia's own nuclear age, and particularly just given what happened in May 2025, I'm increasingly open to the possibility that there will actually be lessons for the rest of the world to take away from what India and Pakistan have experienced in the last 28 years together. So as an analyst, I continue to be fascinated by the shifting strategic dynamics in this region, because I do think even if you're studying U.S.-China dynamics, U.S.-Russia dynamics, what's been happening between India and Pakistan is a really, really interesting laboratory to look at the role of everything from non-nuclear technologies to the nature of escalation in conventional crises. And for me, I think, like I said in the piece, I don't think the book is going to be closed on May 2025 for a very long time. We're having this conversation in July, and there are still significant outlying questions. So I will continue to examine this case with quite a bit of interest.
Yeah, well, the Indian official statement, which has come out from no less than the Prime Minister himself, is that this is not a ceasefire, just a pause. And the policy that he's laid out is essentially a policy which says that we are in a state of war with Pakistan. But that's a separate topic. One of the things that you mentioned in the Caravan article, frankly, is about the fact that the two sides do not really have any communication channels. I mean, they do have hotlines, but no one picks up the phone. And so there is the issue of third parties. This is something that was the thesis of Dr. Moeed Yusuf's book on brokered bargaining. He recently wrote all about this in Arms Control Today on this, about third parties, which obviously doesn't redound to India's advantage. But, frankly, every time India attacks Pakistan or thinks of attacking Pakistan, as we've seen this time, without any evidence of Pakistan's complicity, it gets rehyphenated with. Go back to your broader thesis. Since I haven't read the book, do you talk about the conventional nuclear entanglement in the book and how it complicates the deterrence calculus?
Yeah, I do. So, I talk quite a bit. So there's a whole chapter about technology, and that's kind of divided up into how the various technological domains are shifting and why they matter for the nuclear balance. So, conventional nuclear entanglement in space is a particular focus of mine, just given that I actually spend more time working on, U.S.-China dynamics and U.S.-Russia dynamics than I do, India-Pakistan, for instance. So that's a very pertinent issue in those particular dyads. And then the other issue that I devote quite a bit of time to, which I've been working quite a bit on, is of course the meaningfully new state of affairs we're in today, where non-nuclear states, including countries like South Korea, to perhaps Poland and other NATO allies, with precise conventional munitions, can actually drive, in my opinion, escalation with nuclear armed adversaries. And so there is a need to understand that and to tightly operationally integrate. This is something the US worries about quite a bit in sort of managing its alliances, because unlike during the Cold War, when it was largely the United States, with some exceptions like the French, but it was largely the United States that would take the initiative, so to speak, in a process of escalation. Today, it could be South Korea vis-a-vis North Korea. It could be some of NATO's eastern flank allies vis-a-vis the Russians. So those dynamics, too, I think, are meaningfully distinct from what we've grown accustomed to. So it's not just the nuclear protagonists that matter in this third nuclear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, one of my hypothetical scenarios was, when I was thinking about this, I actually wrote about this, was hypothetical Ukrainian non-nuclear strategic strike on Russian SSBN in the Black Sea. How does Russia respond to that?
Well, I mean, after Operation Spiderweb, I think a lot of us are going to be talking about this particular dynamic. I mean, the single biggest loss of nuclear delivery systems ever, right, in the entire nuclear age. I mean, it's just fascinating just to look at the last few months. Right.
Yeah.
We're talking in July 2025. Let's just go back, May 2025, India and Pakistan, broadest spectrum war fighting between two nuclear armed countries. Iran, Israel. Iran strikes on Israel were the largest attack on any nuclear possessor's homeland. I mean, we can talk about the efficacy, but the number of ballistic missiles launched was simply striking. And then, of course, Operation Spiderweb, the largest loss of nuclear delivery systems. So something is, I think, fundamentally changing in the ways in which the use of force is manifesting between nuclear countries and between non-nuclear and nuclear countries, as we sort of saw.
This also sets the stage, frankly, Ankit, for further discussion of these issues. Get hold of your book, which obviously will provide a very good peg for another discussion on this. Thank you so much for being on the program and for your insights. And finally, I mean, in terms of how to get out of this in an ideal world, I'm reminded of that 1983 techno thriller War Games, the supercomputer Whopper, ultimately as a simple lesson for states with nuclear weapons. The only winning move is not to play. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button and send us comments. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.